Hello and welcome to Compass, a production of Pioneer Public Television. I'm Les Heen, your host for Compass. It's a weekly discussion of public policy issues facing our viewing area. This week, a discussion of the importance of listening and sharing the stories of veterans. There are stories of battles past and battles still being fought, struggles that could be mentally and physically challenging for veterans. But when a struggle is shared or a voice given, that's often how healing begins, and we say honor remains. First, we have the story of the Tournament of Duty in Atwater, Minnesota. This event has veterans and other community members coming together for some time to relax, talk, and even have some family competition. Here's Pioneer's Laura K. Prosser with that story.
The Tournament of Duty started out as a fundraiser for the Wounded Warrior Project. It was picked by Paul White due to his family military ties when he was named National Volunteer of the Year for Thrivent Financial. But the tournament has exceeded Paul's expectations, and the impact it has had on veterans has been priceless. Here's why.
So I was kind of scratching my head a little bit about what national charity would be good. And I was visiting with one of my brothers who had served in the military, and he says, check out the Wounded Warrior Project. So that was the first time I'd gone on their website, and I knew at that time, once I went on and I started to see some of the videos, some of the stories of the warriors coming back, some of the things that they're going to be dealing with the rest of their lives as young men, and put their lives on the line for our freedoms here that we can enjoy. I knew that that was the right charity to work with, and really kind of grew from there.
But the real story isn't about Paul and his efforts behind the tournament. It's the impact such charity work has on veterans and the shared stories that seem to repeat year after year.
One veteran can meet another veteran and they've never known each other at all, but as soon as they make that bond that we're both veterans, that gate just opens up and you can tell your stories. You know, there's multiple stories you hear, from all ages. You hear from the World War II vet, you hear it from the Korean vet, all the way up to the Middle Eastern vets. And it's kind of fun to see where they've been, what they've done, what they've seen. So you maybe don't hear the story and how they became a wounded warrior, but some of the wounded warriors that are coming through here, you'd probably never even realize that they were a wounded warrior. The best way of putting it is a veteran doesn't always share their stories with somebody who hasn't been there, seen that, done that. But everybody's got a story. Maybe their story is it's more like a nightmare versus a happy story. And you need to be able to get away and rejuvenate yourself and get yourself out of that frame of mind from the military. Not all of us had happy thoughts while we were there, but we are going to today.
Bill Reiser is one of those veterans who came back with less than happy thoughts from his time in the service, and he used the tournament to fight the nightmares of PTSD.
You bring a lot of those invisible wounds back, so you start to learn through therapy like what your triggers are. So you get angry, you get depressed, you might self-medicate, and you find yourself isolating a lot. It's your comfort zone. It's just, for lack of a better word, it's like your Linus blanket from the Peanuts, Charlie Brown. That's where I feel comfortable, is at home. But then, I've been going to therapy at the VA, and some of my things I have to work on is just getting out of my comfort zone. So then when you come to somewhere like this, it's small, there's not a lot of people, because large crowds is a trigger for me, and it's just intimate enough where everybody that you speak with has a genuine concern for the veteran. And for me, I've been in it 21 years, I've been doing therapy for the last 5 years. To me, this has been the most genuine interaction that I've had. And that's the reason why I keep on coming back to an event like this, because it shows me that, hey, Bill, there's, society is not that spoiled. There's people that really genuinely care, and just having the conversation, on the golf course, just that, embrace makes it a wonderful experience. So that's what I can say I took from last year's, which brought me back again this year.
With us now to discuss Veterans Voices and the efforts that it has to give a voice to these stories, we have Trista Matas-Castillo, and she's with the Minnesota Humanities Center. And along with her to share his personal story, we have Veterans Voices awardee, Richard Leonard. Richard, Trista, thanks for coming on Compass.
Thanks for having us.
This is such an exciting program that I was fortunate enough to learn about in the last couple of years because, in interest of self-disclosure, I'm on the board of the Minnesota Humanities Center and largely learned about it there. So, Trista, I'd like to start with you. What is Veterans Voices? What is the program?
Yeah, so our Veterans Voices program is a program to give the voice to the veteran. You know, so often in the media and social media and the news, you kind of hear a bifurcated story. So we're either superheroes or we're social problems. And the truth is that we have a lot more stories to tell and to share. I know as veterans, when we watch movies, military movies, or there's a veteran in it, we're watching it and we're like, that's just not true. They didn't get it right. And so we said, let's give a chance to bring our voices to the table, to share our experiences with our community so that our community can be fully engaged with us as veterans.
Sure. And this is a program of the Minnesota Humanities Center. When did it start?
So we officially started in 2013 when we launched our first Veterans Voices Award ceremony on September 11th, and that is an annual event that occurs every year on September 11th, recognizing the contributions of veterans across the state of Minnesota. And so we started that program and then continued from there.
And Richard, you got involved right from the very start. I know you had a big role in starting this.
Yes, I did. I think when we did the first one, I helped out with helping to, read the stories of our nominees and help to pick the awards, who was going to receive the award. Yep.
Yeah, and I know for many veterans, they will take a look at something like this and say, "Gosh, what are we getting enough attention around Veterans Day or veterans issues?" And I know for you, it seemed to be an idea where you really thought that there should be more engagement at all age levels of understanding what veterans go through, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's not enough stories, right? There's not enough people telling their story, and for programs like this to come forward, like Trista said, gives us the ability to tell our story and do it with our voice and not, like the movies or what you read in books or articles. You can hear it right from the horse's mouth.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and for people who have studied humanities or been humanities majors, I mean, that's often about the stories of the human condition.
Exactly.
Or the philosophy. And so humanities can be defined in many different ways, but at its core, it's about stories of the human condition. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I know you've been doing this for a few years now. I'm just going to ask, what have you learned? That's a tough question. How much time do you have?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, we have learned some really core themes that veterans over and over and over say, this is the most important thing we want people to know and understand. A lot of times you'll hear about programs for veterans or about veterans, and we come from an approach of with and from. So veterans are involved in every step of the way of the program. Every part of our programs is developed with and from veterans. And we've kind of discovered that there's some core themes that matter. Themes like duty, family, that it is more than just a job to have served in the military, that we have different motivations and a variety of motivations, that it is really about a bigger cause, and that not every veteran has been in combat, right? So it is both combat and non-combat, and what that means to have served in the military. So we've kind of got those program themes that really are about transformation and resiliency, and I think that has been consistent throughout. In fact, so much so that in our first year even, we declared the entire month of October Veterans Voices Month, which is really exciting, and that came from Richard himself.
So Richard, you had the idea, and as I understand it, Minnesota is the only state in the nation that has a designated Veterans Voices Month, where it's about getting veterans to tell their stories. Only place in the country, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. We're the tip of the spear.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, too, that I think is important for anyone watching the program to know is that, you two aren't just working on veterans issues, but you share a veterans experience.
Yes.
Both as veterans and then veterans working together in the service. So,
Yes.
So tell us about that, Richard.
Oh, go ahead.
So Richard and I first met in 2003, I think, when I was actually Richard's platoon leader in the Minnesota National Guard, and he was in my platoon. So we first met then and have served together for several years. And then when I left the military, Richard is still serving, but when I left the military, we've kept in contact. And so whenever I find there's something good going on, I call him and say, this is something you should be involved in. And so
she hasn't led me astray yet. It's always pretty good things that she asks me to do,
Yeah.
So often we hear about the fact that when people come back from veterans, whether it's combat or non-combat experience, they tend to, they often want to move on with their lives. Mm-hmm. And it's difficult to understand the role that telling the story is for them, because it's different things for different people and how they're ready to tell it or how they're going to tell it. As Veterans Voices has evolved, what are we learning about the importance that storytelling is for those veterans and their families? What are we learning?
Well, I think in my opinion, it's in a way it's therapeutic, and it's a relief to be able to know that there is a forum or there is a place where, as a veteran, I can go and I can speak freely and I can tell my story, and know, number one, that I'm not going to be judged, because I think that there has been stereotypes of what veterans are. Like Trista said, either social problems or heroes. And I think that when people actually realize that, like, I have a job, I have bills that sometimes I can't pay, I get sick, all those things, that life happens. So being able to articulate that and know that just because I'm a veteran, it doesn't mean that I'm going to do something bad and be a criminal, and I'm certainly not a superhero, right? I'm just a regular guy, but I chose a different path, right? And so being able to have that forum to do that is super, super important. And I think we've learned in the last few years that it's just broadening the understanding for the community as a whole.
Yeah, and also too, I think, is it also about, to a certain extent, taking people who might not think of themselves as a writer, as a storyteller, because there are a lot of barriers. We say, well, I'm not a writer, or well, I'm not a good public speaker, and so providing an environment where they come out for the first time with a story and find their voice in that way.
Yeah, well, so actually, another venture that Trista had pointed me towards was the Telling Project. So last year, I did Telling Minnesota at the Guthrie Theater, and they took 7 veterans of all eras, and we stood on a stage in front of, I think it was 200 or 300 people, and spilled our guts about our experience. It was somewhat traumatizing, but also a relief. So there was a full gamut of emotions, right? But it was, at the end, it was a huge relief to know that I got it out, right? People know now. Because I think one of the biggest travesties in our country is that, like our World War II veterans, for example, you'll talk to them or their families and they'll say, well, they never talked about it. It's really sad that those stories are dying along with these men and women. So the Telling Project, for example, was a huge, huge way for 7 of us to tell our stories to people who want to hear it.
And I'm sure you had an audience that included people who were veterans, people who weren't veterans, people who, through that experience, tell me about what the audience reaction was. Well, there were some funny parts. So there was laughter, there were tears, there were, unfortunately, a couple folk. We did talkbacks when we were done, so the cast would sit on the stage and the audience could ask questions. And unfortunately, there were a couple people who had a negative response, but it is what it is. But for the most part, there was a lot of support. There was a lot of thank yous. There was a lot of, I never knew that. I couldn't imagine that. And so it was good to hear. But the talkback part strikes me that is critical here, because for a lot of this, isn't it really not just about the expression, but also then starting the conversation, right?
We actually believe the conversation is the most important part. So the great thing about the humanities, there's lots of different tools to for our purposes. So we use theater, we use literature, we use education curriculum, dance, but what happens afterwards is really the meat and potatoes. It is that talkback part. So it's the opportunity for non-veterans and veterans to have that shared experience of whatever the piece of art, the thing they just did together, to talk about it and ask more questions and go deeper. And what we're finding is that we're creating connections in communities where people are meeting each other, they're working together, they're shedding those kind of what they thought was true for reality. We are not a therapy agency. We're not a social service agency. We're not doing any direct service to veterans. There are lots of other organizations that do that. What we're doing is bringing communities together in real relationships and conversations. And we're finding that we're filling a huge gap. I mean, we can hardly keep up with the demand because we cover the entire state of Minnesota. So we're on the road and traveling and doing events in different places. But it really is growing very fast, which is incredible.
Well, and you have people getting together sort of in smaller groups and having these discussions. Then I know you had a big event on September 11th, and where you bring more people together. So what is it like when you get all of these people together, like at the September 11th event?
Yeah, well, the September 11th event in itself has about 500 people that come together to recognize and award veterans that are recognized in their community for being leaders in whatever aspect. So, you know, the best teachers and farmers and, you know, all kinds of folks that are being recognized for doing their great things in their community that happen to be veterans. And it just changes the conversation. Not to mention the connections and the networks that grow. You know, as soon as you know someone else, you remember their story, you have a connection. Minnesota is such a small place. The Midwest is a small place. And after our conversation, I think we'll all kind of figure out we're related to each other, right? And so, or we have some kind of shared experience. And so that's what's happening, is we're discovering that we have more in common that connects us than we do that divides us.
And what some people, I think, might not know about the upper Midwest, let's just say not just Minnesota, but beyond that, is that there is a very strong tradition of military service and military service families and people who have an expectation that they go in. So talk about that, you know, and how that may be different from other parts of the country or other parts of, you know, other parts of military service, because it's a very strong tradition here that people talk about.
Yeah, it is. It is. Minnesota, you know, has sent people since the Civil War to serve in every single conflict. The Red Bulls have served in every conflict, and kind of that Midwest. And we don't have an active duty military base. So that really speaks something, because we're not exposed to that active duty base. You know, people aren't like, oh, it's a job, it's a career field. But it really is about a sense of duty and motivation and longstanding history. And so we have we have 400,000 veterans in Minnesota alone. In the Midwest, you know, it's, I don't know, double that maybe.
So almost 10% of the population.
Yeah, 10% of the population in the Midwest, and that's not necessarily the case in other places. Places that are even bigger and have active duty bases don't have those numbers.
You mentioned the Red Bulls a moment ago, and for the benefit of people who aren't familiar with that division, you know, just because I know you're both there, tell us about that.
Yeah.
The Red Bull division.
Well, the 34th Infantry Division is, you know, I think most recently, in 2005 to 2007, we had the longest tour of duty in Iraq of any Army unit in our country. So the tradition is very, very strong. You know, just for example, there is one of the 194 is a cavalry unit that was the Battling Bastards of Bataan. So that unit came from Minnesota. So there's just a very, very rich history of military service dating all the way back to the Civil War.
Yeah. And to be clear, the Red Bull Division, which is primarily in Minnesota, some in Iowa, is one of the divisions here in Minnesota. There are other divisions, they just happen to be the largest. So we also have reserve forces here of every branch of the service, and Air and Army National Guard as well. So to be clear, we have everything covered, active duty components, we have a lot of service members, and you know, within our military culture there's a little bit of badgering that goes on. So I don't want this to be about the Red Bulls, it just happens to be what most of us are familiar with.
Right, and of course what you were familiar with. So, I mean, I'm just curious, you spent a lot of time meeting with other veterans, helping with other veterans, and of course, as veterans, you have your own stories. So, what have you learned about your own story?
I guess the most important thing I've learned about my own story is that it just needs to be told. I spent a lot of time not talking about it and not saying what needs to be said, and it got a lot off my shoulders to be able to know that I had a place like the Humanities Center or the Telling Project to be able to just unload it. And I guess I don't expect anybody to carry that weight for me, but it was great to be able to just let it out.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, sharing my own story, you know, I have a kind of diverse military history. I actually served in 3 different branches of the service, which I joke that makes me bilingual, you know, right? So I served in the Navy, the Marine Corps, and exactly.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is that by being able to share my story opens the door for someone else to share theirs. And that really has been helpful, is that having the courage to share my story, even in part, you know, and And I also want to be clear, is like sometimes it's not hard to share our stories because it is who we are, and we have some pretty funny stories too. Let me tell you, military service isn't all dark clouds. There's some really great moments and some great times in sharing those stories. It opens the door both for other vets to share their story, but it also opens the door for people who are not familiar with military service to ask questions, because there is a curiosity, and it's something that we truly need to understand. If we're going to continue to have, ask people to serve, to sacrifice their lives, to leave their families, to go overseas, then we need to know what we're really asking them.
So when you're starting to talk about veterans' voices, let's say someone who's watching and they have a veteran at home and they haven't talked, how do you start that conversation? Is there any particular advice you'd have? Because, I mean, some people, again, they may be ready to talk, maybe not, but it's certainly important.
Well, I think being able to find somebody initially that you're comfortable talking to. And, I think that I probably told my story in confidence to people 5, 6, 7, 10 times before I was able to address a larger group or be able to talk to a stranger about it. But just being able to, and it's a big first step. I mean, it's a real leap. But, it gets easier every time. And like Trista said, it's not all dark stuff. So you get to play comedian sometimes, right? You get good responses. Sometimes you get, iffy responses, but just being able to make that initial step to let it out is for me was the biggest hurdle.
Here is Richard Leonard's testimony for Veterans Voices.
I was in the turret of a vehicle somewhere in Iraq. It was very dark, night, of course. My only job that evening was to protect the 32 vehicles in front of me from danger. I can remember headlights coming up from the rear of our vehicle. At that time, I was told to start my escalation of force continuum, right? We had tools to try to get these vehicles to stop so they don't come up to the rear of our convoy and potentially hurt us or the people and vehicles that we're protecting. So part of those tools were a big, huge spotlight that you flicker to try to get them to stop, and when that doesn't work, you use flares in the air and then down towards the vehicle. Well, none of these had worked, and so the next step is to fire warning shots off the pavement of the vehicle in front of this car. And when that doesn't work, with 5 to 7 rounds from my automatic weapon, I fired into the hood of that car, which at this point was probably about 300 meters from me. The vehicle then rolled over. It landed on its wheels. The gentleman that was the commander of our vehicle had radioed ahead to stop the whole convoy, all 33-ish vehicles, and told me, let's go look, let's go see what's going on. Knowing in my mind that wasn't right. We probably weren't supposed to do that. I didn't argue, I just got out and did it. And as we made our way back to the vehicle, there was a headlight still on and a tail light still on. The passenger side of the vehicle caved in, and as we walked up to the vehicle, all I noticed was that there were 4 dead bodies in this car. There was a man and a woman in the front and 2 young boys in the back. A family, clearly. And I can remember looking down at the man in the driver's seat and his eyes open, looking up at the sky, almost as if he was just staring off into nowhere. Clearly dead. The little boy behind him had gunshot wounds just below his neck and in his face. All of them were dead. When the search of this vehicle was satisfied by the vehicle commander who had initiated it, we made our way back to our truck, got in, and continued on down the road. He never reported it. I never reported it. So for a year, I sat with this on my own. I didn't talk to anybody about it. They had left. They went home to Georgia. So when I finally made the decision to open my mouth and told my very best friend, who was part of my team in Iraq, we kind of had a conversation about it, and that's about as far as it went. Now, this action had happened, and this was my very, very first time in combat, my very first mission. So by the time I got home in July of 2007, I had already went through that and 16 months more of missions and convoys and IEDs and gunfights and all that other stuff. My coping mechanisms were not the greatest. I used to, we did a lot of drinking, me and a couple of my buddies, and we did a whole lot of picking fights at bars. And I know that I'm a big fella, but I got my ass whooped a few times. But the point is that it wasn't safe, it wasn't right. There was better ways to deal with it. And so about a year and a half of screwing around, drinking and fighting, and not even looking or asking for help. One evening, I found myself sitting on a bridge over the St. Croix River. I brought a 12-pack of beer with me, and I had made the decision that this was it. When this Coors Light's gone, I'm going with it. And so as I got to the end, the only thing I could see in my mind was my son's face. And I was wondering about what kind of legacy would I leave or not leave behind for him. Would I end up hurling myself off this bridge because I can't deal, I can't cope? The only way I can figure out to deal with this is to drink and maybe win a fight at a bar. Or am I going to walk my punk ass off this bridge, and am I going to do the right thing and raise my son to be a good man, or at least give it a good shot? And so, clearly, off the bridge I went. I got back in my car and drove back to home. But that only lasted a couple of days, because a couple of days later I was right back to my same old tricks with my buddies down in the bar, drinking as much as we could, or at least till our pockets were empty of money, and trying to pick fights with the biggest, baddest dude in the bar. And then one day, probably about 2 or 3 months later, I had dropped my son off at school, and I went back home, and home at the time was my mother's place because I had gotten divorced. And she said to me, let's go have breakfast, which was weird because we never have breakfast, right? Barely ever. But when we do, there's about 2 places that we go, that we frequent, and she drove right past those pretty quickly. And I thought to myself, she's driving me to the VA hospital. And I asked her, I said, Ma, are we going to the VA? And she said, well, yeah, they have food there too. We can certainly find something to eat at the VA hospital. And it clicked for me. I had never asked for help up until this point. And all the things that I have and probably still do hide from my mother about my service and about my past, if she can see it, there's definitely a problem. And so somehow I talked her into turning the car around, and I told her that I will bring myself. You know, I can't have my mom walk me into the VA, right? Like, that's not cool. And she did. And the next day, I went there, and I just walked in and asked for some help. 2 weeks later, I sat my butt down in front of an employment counselor at the workforce center. And this man I sat in front of put it to me straight. He told me that I was going to get my together and get a job that means something, not just to me, but to everybody else. And so what I really learned, the lesson that I started to learn, and today I'm still learning all the time, is that being vulnerable and asking for help didn't make me weak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard Leonard and Trista Mattis Castillo about Veterans Voices. Thank you for joining us on Compass. That's it for this week on Compass. Join us next week for more people, places, and issues facing our region. Thanks.